Bruchim Haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Ayin Vov Amud Aleph. Starting with the new Mishnah on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis. The Mishnah continues to discuss laws related to the roasting of the carbon Pesach. Says the Mishnah, Nagoi Bechar Soy Shel Tanur. If the meat of the carbon Pesach touches the oven, the ceramic, the cheres of the tanur, yikloif es mekoimoi, you must peel off that place of the Pesach that touched the cheres. Notaf miroitvoi ala cheres, if the roitev, the juice of the carbon went onto the cheres, v'chazar elov, and then went back and came in contact with the carbon. Yitol es mekoimoi, you must take that piece, that area from the carbon. Here it's not just peeling off, which is the superficial outer place of the meat, but rather taking a thumb's breadth, the agudal, that has to be then taken, that meat has to be taken from the carbon. And now we have to burn it because it's possible. Notaf roitvoy al hasoiles, if the roitev, the juice of the carbon, went onto flour, yikmoit es mekoimoi, here you have to peel the mekoimoi of the carbon. Here we're talking about where the juice went into the flour, then that flour came back into contact with the carbon. So you have to be koimates. Koimates over here means you take a handful from the meat of the carbon, and again that has to be burnt. Now in all these cases, the reason why it's possible that the meat has to be burnt is because the Torah requires that it be tzli eish. That means that the roasted meat of the carbon Pesach be directly from the fire. But here is as a result of either coming in contact with the cheres or the flour, and therefore here the meat becomes then pasul and has to be burnt, like all other karbonos that became pasul. The Mishnah continues, Sachai b'shemen truma, a carbon Pesach was smeared with oil of truma. There's no problem putting a oil on the carbon, and here we're talking about oil of truma, so it depends. Im chaburas kohanim, then yoichlu. If the chabura of this carbon Pesach is made up of kohanim, so it's permissible because kohanim, of course, can eat truma. However, im shel Yisrael, it depends. Im chayhu yidichenu. If it's merely raw, it hasn't yet even been roasted, then just wash it off, and then the chabur can go ahead and eat such a carbon Pesach afterwards, after it's roasted. However, im tzlihu, if it was already roasted and then it was put some oil of truma on it, then yikloif es hachitzon, you must then peel out the outer layer of the carbon. The Mishnah goes on to say, Sacho b'shem meiser sheni. If meiser sheni oil was rubbed on the carbon, then lo yasenu damim al bnei chabur. You cannot, yasenu damim here means you cannot moicher, you can't sell the value of this oil to the people of the chabura, because after all, we're talking about meiser sheni, and we're talking about in Yerushalayim. So you cannot go ahead and take money for that. Shein poidin meiser sheni b'Yerushalayim. You cannot, poidin here refers to you cannot sell the meiser sheni in Yerushalayim. The Gemara now tells us about different types of things that come in contact one with the other. In other words, you have one thing that might be mutter, another thing that is osir. If the two come in contact with it, what is the din? Says the Gemara, itmar. We have the following statement: Cham letoich cham, divrei hakol osir. If you have one item that is cham, another item that is cham, let's say one that is solid, one that is liquid, and one is mutter, one is osir, then osir, both become osir, even the item that is mutter. Tzoynein letoich tzoynein. We're on top of ayin vav amud aleph. You have cold that comes into contact with the cold, then divrei hakol mutter. Everybody will agree that that is going to be mutter. All you have to do is wash it off. Cham letoich tzoynein, v'tzoynein letoich cham. However, if you have cham that comes into tzoynein, into cold, or vice versa, then it's a machlokes amoraim. Rav Omar Eloi Gvar, Ushmo Omar Tatoi Gvar. Rav says Eloi, the top, that is Gvar, that takes then is going to be Goiver. What does that mean? That since the top has more strength than the bottom, in the first case where you have Cham Letoich Tzoinen, then the Cham will cause that which is in the Tzoinen to then become heated up, and it'll cause it to be osir. Whereas tzoinen letoicham, that will not be osir because the tzoinen is on top, and that will not come then totally absorbed of the heat of the other item, and therefore, according to Rav, that would be mutter. And Shmuel would say the exact opposite. Shmuel says the tatoi is gevar, the bottom one, that is going to have the greater strength. And therefore, in the first case where you have cham that goes into tznoin, so then it would be mutter because the tznoin doesn't have the wherewithal to become absorbed by the cham, since the tznoin, the cold on the bottom, the tznoin rather on the bottom, is going to be stronger. Whereas in the reverse case, where the tznoin goes into the cham is going to be goiver, and therefore the cham will then cause the tzoinen to then absorb. Gemara now brings the following, our Mishnah, to try to ask a question on Shmuel Shita that tatoi is gvar. Tnan, it says in our Mishnah, notaf miroit voy ala cheres v'chozar elov yitel es mekamot. The Mishnah states that you have some of the roitev of the carbon, and that goes on the cheres. And then that roitev that went on the cheres goes back into the carbon Pesach. And it states, the din is you have to then be yitel es mekoimo, you have to take up the piece that it went into from the carbon. That is posel and has to be burnt. So the Gemara then says, the Gemara understands that the Mishnah is talking about the cheres, that the roitev of the carbon went into, is talking about cold cheres, like a ceramic plate. So Bishlama l'Rav d'Omar Eloi Gavar, according to Rav, that says the top is one is going to then have more strength. Then Mishum Hachi Yitol as Mekoimoy. Then we understand why you take from the meat of the carbon, because it's possible. Why? Explains the Gemara. The Ozol Roitev Miratach Le Lecheres V'Hodar Cheres Miratach Le Leroitev. The gravy of the meat that went onto the cheres, so that was considered to be the Eloi, the higher one that is stronger. That it comes in contact with the cheres, whereby that will then heat up the cheres, which would also then transfer the heat back onto the roitev. And then that roitev is going to go onto the meat again. V'chihoda roitev a pesach ki mitvei pesach machmas chamimusu decheres. Whereby since that roitev comes back onto the meat of the carbon pesach, then it also is going to be roasted by that juice, by that roitev. Whereby it's not completely being roasted by the eish. And therefore, it is something that is possible. So this is understood according to Rav, who says that the ilah is gevar. But according to Shmuel, who says the bottom is stronger than cheres, kivan ditzoinenhu akure meikar le'leroitev. Then it would come out that the roitev that comes from the carbon onto the cold ceramic, so then the cold ceramic is gvar, whereby it will cool off the roitev. When it goes back onto the carbon pesach, why should you have to take out that meat of the carbon pesach and burn it? There's no reason why that should be then posel. Answers the Gemara, the Omar Rav Yirmiyahu Amar Shmuel, like Rav told Shmuel, besoiles rotachas, that in the next case in the Mishnah, we're talking about the soiles that is rotachas, it's heat, it's burning hot. Hochanami becheres roteach. So too, we're talking about the ceramic that's not a ceramic plate, as we just thought it was talking about, but rather the Mishnah is talking about the cheres of the oven itself, which is burning hot. Then we're talking about that since it will then have the juice that goes onto that hot oven, and the hot oven will then have the juice come back onto the meat. So then that meat of the Korban Pesach is also being roasted by the heat from the oven and not just from the fire. And it says sli eish, and therefore requiring sli eish and not sli. That's machmas midover acher. The Gemara now tries to ask on Shmuel from the next part of the Mishnah, Tnan. Not dafmei roitvei ala soiles. When the roitev of the meat goes onto flour, the din is yikmoitz es mikoima. You have to then take a koimetz, a handful from the place of the meat, and then burn it because it's posel. Again, the same idea that the heat of the flour of the roitev that was on the flour that comes back now onto the meat will then cause that meat to become also roasted, not only from the fire, whereby it's posel. So Gemara understands, we're talking about that the soiles, the flour, was cold. And since the flour is cold, explains the Gemara, Bishlam, the same type of rationales we had just had in the previous Gemara. Bishlam l'rav, do'omar Eloi Gvar, who says that the top is stronger than Mishum Hochi Yikmoites Mekoimoi. That's why we have to then take out part of the meat. Because, as the Gemara explains now, the Meratech, it heated up the soiles. That means the juice, the gravy of the meat, went onto the flour, which was cold. Then it heated it up because, according to Rab, the Eloi is Gvar. And then the Hadar Hadrane, and it caused the area of the flour around it to become hot. The Hadre soiles Lididei. Then the soiles went and came in contact with the basar of the meat, whereby that meat then has heat that again was coming to be heated up, not solely from the eish. Whereby the meat of the Korban Pesach is also becoming heated up, becoming roasted by that heat source. And therefore it's possible because the Torah requires that it be dafka sli eish. However, that's only according to Rav. Ela the Shmuel, the Omar. Tatoi Gvar, who learns that the bottom is considered to be stronger, that takes then is the stronger of the two. Then soiles kivan the tsoinenesi akure komiyakarle mekarle. Then the soiles, which is cold, when you have the roitef from the juice of the carbon going onto the flour, then the cold flour should then not absorb the heat of the roitev. When it comes back onto the meat, it should not then cause the meat to be roasted from that source because it's considered to be cold. Whereby, why is it then possible that you have to burn it? Answers the Gemara, here is where it states, originally Omar Yirmiyahu, Omar Shmuel, Besoiles Roitachas. We're talking about that the flour was indeed already very hot, and therefore when we're talking about that the tatoi is gevar and echanami, because it was already hot over here too. So therefore when the heat of the gravy comes in contact with the heat of the flour, and then comes back the flour onto the meat, indeed the meat is also being roasted by the hot flour. The Gemara now brings the latter part of the Mishnah Tnan. It states, S'choi b'shemen shel truma. If they smeared shemen shel truma on the Korban Pesach, the din is, im hachaburos kohanim yoichlu. If the chabur of this Korban Pesach is made up of kohanim, no problem. Kohanim can eat truma. However, im shel Yisrael, if the chabur is made out of Yisrael and not kohanim, so then it depends. Im chayu yidichenu. If it's something that is raw, the meat is raw when it was smeared with this type of oil that is of truma, then yadichenu, merely just wash it off. In slihu yikleif as achitzon. However, if it was already roasted, then when he smeared on after it was roasted, so then merely take off the outer by peeling out the outer layer of the meat. The Gemara says, Bishlam l'rav, That's very good according to Rav Damar Eloi Gvar. Then Amtu Lahachi Sagi Le Beklipas Mishum Di Eloi Tsoynein Hu. Then it's very good according to Rav, who says at the top the Eloi is Gvar. Then that's why it's enough to then take out only the klipa, only the peeling off of the outer layer, because we're talking about where the top, the outer part was soinin rather, was cold. So therefore it's understood. Ela l'shmuel, in other words, the oil of the truma is cold, and that's put onto the meat of the roasted meat that was already roasted. El l'shmuel d'amar tatoy gvar. But according to Shmuel, who says it's the bottom that's gvar, then kivan dechamhu mivla bolo. Then the roasted meat, which is hot, that should cause the cold shemen to then also become heated up, whereby it won't be sufficient just to take off the klipa. It should be requiring that you take off all of the animal wherever that shemen is. Amai sagili beklipa nitzer ligami. The whole thing should be osir, and you have to then say that the whole thing has to be burnt. And says the Gemara, here it's different. Why? Because shiny sicha the mashu ba'almahu da'avida, the amount of oil that's smeared on the animal is very minuscule, and that little amount does not require more than the klipa to be removed. Now that the Gemara has then defended successfully Shmuel from all three parts of our Mishnah, the Gemara now brings a brisa, in fact two brisos that support Shmuel. Tanya kavase de Shmuel, cham letoicham oser. The brisa goes on to say that cham letoicham is oser according to everybody. V'chein tzoyin shenosim letoicham oser. However, here the brisa then indicates like Shmuel Shita. It states not only is cham letoicham oser, but also tzoyin letoicham is oser. So we see that tato is gvar. The cham letoich tzoyin, the brisa goes on to say when you have hot that goes to toich tzoyin, v'tzoyin letoich tzoyin mediach, merely then wash it off. Again, according to Shita Shmuel, because the tato is gvar. Cham letoich tzoyin. The Gemara now challenges this latter din in the Mishnah. Cham letoich tzoyin mediach. Granted, tato is gvar, the Shita of Shmuel, but why is it only mediach when the cham comes in tatach with tzoyin? Kiven the cham hu ademekar lei yefshel lo bola purta. It's not possible that at least a little bit would also then be absorbed into the meat. So then, klipa miha niboy, is it sufficient just to then go ahead and wash it off? You would have to also take a klipa from it. Ela ema, you're right. Say cham letoich tzoynein koilef. If you have cham letoich tzoynein, then you have to be koilef. Tzoynein letoich tzoynein mediach, and tzoynein letoich tzoynein with mediach. So the Gemara does explain and changes that din in the brisa to say that even if it's cham letoich tzoynein, and the sheet of Shmuel that tato is gvar, still you have to take off the outer klipa. Tanya Ida, we have another brisa that supports Shmuel. Basar roteach shenafal letoich cholav roteach. When you have hot meat that comes into contact with hot milk, v'chein soinein shenafal letoich cham oser. And similarly, when you have soinein that comes in contact with cham, it's also going to be also again, like Shmuel says, because the tatoi is gevar. Cham letoich tzoynein, v'tzoyin letoich tzoynein mediach. If you have cham, which is toich tzoynein, or tzoyin letoich tzoynein, then the din is mediach. Here the Gemara asks similarly, cham letoich tzoynein mediach. Why is it that you're only mediach when cham comes to toich tzoynein? Granted, we say like Shmuel, according to this brisa, it's like Shmuel that tato is gvar, but still, kiven decham hu ademekar lei yefshel lo bola purta. It's impossible that just a little bit will not be absorbed into the meat. Then, therefore, klipa mihani boy, you should take off the outer layer. Says the Gemara, you're right. You're right. When it comes to then cham letoich tzoynein, that also has the din of koilef. But tzoynein letoich tzoynein, then you just have to then wash it off. Omar mar, the Gemara brings back the previous statement. Tzoynein letoich tzoynein mediach. Cold that's going to go in contact with cold. The din is mediach, just wash it off. Omar Rav Huna lo shanu ela shelo molchoy. That's only if you did not then put a large amount of salt on it. That means that on the forbidden item, you didn't put salt on it. Aval milchoy osir, but if you put a lot of salt on the forbidden item, then it's going to be osir, even the permissible item. The Omar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, Meliach harei keroteach. Meliach, when you salt something, it has a din of being like roteach. Kavush, harei hu kemevushal. Whereas kavush is even more. Kavush is like mevushal. When you go ahead and marinate into vinegar, then that has a din mevushal, whereby the whole item is going to be something that's going to be osir. Omar Rave, Rave said, to qualify this statement, Chada Omar Shmuel Meliach harei keroteach. That which Shmuel said, that by you salt it becomes like roteach. When is that true? That's when it's difficult to eat because of the excessive salt. But if you can still eat it comfortably, then not. That's not going to be considered like roteach. Says the Gemara, there was a pigeon that fell into a dairy type of mixture, sharya, some sort of dairy dip, sharya, which had some salt in it as well. Sharya Rav Chinina Barei Derava Mipash Roshonya, and Rav Chinina Barei Derava, he mattered the milk. He mattered it. Omar Rava said, he mattered the bird also. Amar Rava said, Man chachin the mishra milsa kiha. Who was wise enough to then matir such a matter? Ilav Rav Chinina Berei de Rava mipashroinya. If it wasn't for this chacham, Rav Chinina Berei de Rava, the Gavar Rabbahu, because he's a Gavar Rabbah. Omar Loch, he would say to you, Ki Omar Shmuel Maliach Harehu Keroteach. When did Shmuel say that? We say that Maliach is the din of Roteach she'ein necha machmas milchoy. That's when it's not going to be so salted that you cannot eat it in a comfortable fashion without difficulty. Hi necha machmas milchoy. However, over here you could eat it because of its melach, and therefore it would be permissible. Vahani mili. The Gemara goes on to say, to qualify, when is this true? Chai. That's all true when the meat is chai, it's raw. Avatzli boy klipa. But if the meat was already roasted, then it's not enough just to wash it off. Then you'd have to take off the klipa. This is all true when it doesn't have cracks in it. Because if it had cracks, then it would also be absorbed. Aval is be pili osir, then it also would be osir. It would enter the meat. V'mituval mitavli osir. And also when it does not have cracks, also if it's mitabil with different types of tavlinin, that would also make it also, because that would also cause it to be absorbed into the meat.